recording. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Pedagogy Non Grata podcast. We're back here for another roundtable discussion. This time we're going to be looking at the science of reading, and I am really excited because I believe we have a truly all-star panel. I've been following the work of every single person in this panel for a really long time, and I truly believe they're experts, much more so than myself. So I'm really happy to sit here and learn and chat with these really interesting and intelligent people. I'm going to give a very brief introduction for each of them, and then we're going to jump into questions. And as our panelists know, they can speak on each point, although each question will be addressed towards a specific person. And as I was just explaining to them, I see the real value of these roundtable discussions is finding where's the consensus, where do people agree with each other, where is there a common understanding about what is best practice, as well as a little bit of understanding where there might be less agreement, where there might be some questions, where we might need future research to be conducted. Without further ado, I'm going to start with Dr. Steve Graham. He is the Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College at Arizona State University. For over 30 years, he has studied how writing develops, how to teach it effectively, and how writing can be best used to support reading and learning. He's also an author on numerous meta-analyses on the science of reading and writing. And I must say that is how I'm familiar with his work. I have cited his meta-analyses on numerous of occasions, and I'm really excited to have him on the podcast again and to listen to him in person. Dr. Gillespie Rouse research focused on writing development and instruction. Her approach to understanding writing and how to best prepare teachers to provide writing instruction has been multifaceted. She has conducted meta-analyses and systematic reviews to examine effective writing interventions for struggling writers and students with disabilities, and analyzed interviewed responses to understand students' knowledge of the writing process and different writing genres, conducted surveys to document teachers' use of evidence-based writing instruction, and provide professional development to assist teachers in implementing evidence-based writing instruction in the classroom. She's also developed interventions to support primary students' use of writing as a tool for learning in math and science. Most recently, Dr. Gillespie Rouse and her colleagues have used mixed method reality simulations to support primary pre-service teachers' development of effective writing instruction and pedagogy. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even know what that last thing is. But I have also cited Dr. Gillespie's research on numerous occasions, especially in my book. So I'm really excited to have her on the podcast and listen to her in person for the first time. Lyn Stone is another person who is a returning guest of the podcast, and I'm really excited to hear her speak again. And I've had the privilege of meeting Lyn in person and hearing her talk, and I know that she's incredibly knowledgeable, especially about linguistics, far more so than myself. Lyn's job is to use research evidence in linguistics to produce programs, methods, and texts for students, teachers, and educators worldwide. She gained her linguistics degree at University College London and worked in a variety of speech and language settings in Australia since graduating in 1994. She is also trained in Mackinton Auslin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Read Write Incorporated, Little Learners Love, Literacy Explicit, Direct Instruction, and Spalding. Lyn has been in private practice since 1998 and has continued to train and mentor teachers whilst developing her linguistic-led learning programs. Joan is an experienced educator serving in the roles of teacher, school administrator, teacher trainer, and literacy consultant since 1975. She has provided literacy professional development to thousands of educators related to professionals at schools, colleges, clinics, and professional conferences. Joan received her master's in reading education from Harvard University in 1980, her BA from Boston College in 1975, and from 1975 until 98, Joan worked at Landmark School in Massachusetts, a pioneer school in the development of reading and writing intervention programs. In Landmark, she was a teacher supervisor of tutorials, English language arts, development chair, and high school principal. She was also founder and director of the Landmark College Preparation Program and director of the Landmark Outreach Teacher Training Program. During that time, Joan had also conducted psychoeducational evaluations at the Children's Hospital in Boston. And that was such a mouthful, and I'm glad I've gotten through the summary of your bios. I had to really cut your bios short, and I apologize for that. But I also want the audience to know that you're all incredibly qualified people. And once again, I just want to say I'm very honored to have you all on this podcast today, and I feel very privileged. It's also slightly nerve-wracking to talk to so many people who are much more knowledgeable than myself at the same time. So without further ado, I'm going to get to the first question, which is there such thing as a science of writing? We've heard a lot lately about the science of reading. What about the science of writing? And this question is addressed at you, Steve.
Yeah, I would say there's a science of writing. I'd also say that the science of reading sometimes has been too narrowly constructed or interpreted. I view any kind of scholarship around writing, the teaching of it, how it operates, how it develops, how we use it, as contributing to that idea of a science of writing. If you wanted to look at it just in terms of thinking of science of writing in terms of effective instructional practices, our research is not as deep or as broad as the area of reading, but we have been able to identify a number of practices that are effective and have been consistently effective, both at the elementary and the high school level. So I would say, yes, there's definitely a science of writing, although those of us in writing don't often talk about it in the same way that folks in reading do.
Is there anybody who wants to add on to that?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I think a better term is evidence-based literacy instruction across the board, right? Because reading and writing need to be combined. But if we do have to use that terminology, science of something, I think science of literacy would help include. And then I'd also like to add is, yes, there's not as much, but we have a lot. And a lot of that is thanks to Steve and many others who've done that work over the years. The trick is, how do we get what we've learned from that research to the practitioners in the field, in the trenches? And there's not enough of that happening.
Yeah, and I was, sorry, you go, Lyn.
The other trick that, as I see it, is it's very difficult to evaluate the strategic part of writing. So to see whether or not an approach has an outcome that is better than another approach, when we're talking about text generation, that's really difficult because there's so much subjectivity, whereas within reading, it's very easy to assess reading progress.
I completely agree with that.
I think one thing too that makes maybe this science of writing a little harder to uptake. I spent the last 10 years in Dallas, Texas before I moved here to Australia, and writing wasn't on the statewide assessments. So it was something that often got kind of pushed to the side by teachers because they had to focus on reading and math to meet the accountability performance pay that was happening. So teachers often weren't taking up the things that have been shown in research simply because writing wasn't on that assessment at the end of the year.
If only someone had done research showing there's a connection between writing outcomes and reading outcomes. I do want to say that it is sort of true that there is less, but I kind of agree with everyone here that there is something there for sure. I know I'm updating my second edition of the Scientific Principles of Reading Instruction right now, and I have a section for writing, and it is quite a bit condensed, but there are several meta-analyses been done, and admittedly, several have been done by some of the people in this podcast. I'd like to move on to the next question, which is, many discuss the 5 pillars of literacy. However, these pillars don't actually include writing as usually written about. Is writing simply a pillar of literacy? Is writing a pillar of literacy on its own, or does it belong in one of the other pillars? And this question is for Joan.
Yeah, it deserves its own. I often will look, the whole reason I put together the writing rope framework back in 2018-19 is that I have long felt we need something like that, a framework, just to help teachers identify and be aware of all the skills and strategies and techniques, right, that a proficient writer needs and that they need to be integrated. For years, I used a wagon wheel metaphor, that each one of these buckets, if you will, or component areas are like a wheel, a spoke in a wheel. And if some spokes are missing, but back in 2018, that's when Scarborough's reading rope was gaining popularity. So I switched to that metaphor. What happens is these days, if you go to most ELA teachers and certainly anybody in our field and you say, gee, what are all the components we need? They'll either draw on the National Reading Panel, they can name them all off for you, right? But if you say writing, often it depends on their experience. So if it's a first grade teacher, they'll say, oh, it's spelling and handwriting. And if you talk to somebody in a state that has a heavy duty writing prompt where kids have to read multiple sources, extract information, and they'll say that's what writing is. If you talk to somebody who knows a lot about syntactic awareness and its role in supporting comprehension as well as writing, they'll, oh, it's about sentence combining. So the point is, I do believe there are some components. My attempt was to take all the various skills and strategies that are identified in a lot of state literacy writing standards, but also drawing on a lot of the research that folks, like Steve, have done, and say, all right, there's so many recommendations and so many lists. Steve, I think about that meta-analysis that the Graham Harris Santangelo from 2015, and there's 12, 15, 13 things. It's like, we need to come up, well, I hope I've come up with one that will help people to say, it's a multi-componential thing to teach writing. And we need to make sure that any writing curriculum, or if we feel we need a writing program, that it's hitting all the strands in the rope.
So I've got a follow-up question for you, Joan, just on that. Is it that writing is its own pillar, or is it that we need the 5 pillars of writing?
I think we need we need pillars of writing. Otherwise, people just see it as one little thing, As an example, we just got finished creating 36 hours of online coursework for a particular state Department of Ed, and out of it, only 3 hours is writing, but they're calling it literacy. So, but the problem with a separate, set of pillars, or whatever you want to describe them as, is then people don't realize how they overlap. So if you put one on top of the other, or if you had those old-fashioned overlays, and literally text structure, so many of the strands in the writing rope are instructional practices that will at the same time support comprehension. The transcription strand should happen in a phonics lesson where we're doing decoding and encoding at the same time.
I completely agree with that. Dr. Graham.
So I'm going to approach it in a slightly different way, and actually 2 different ways. One would be, I would say that, if we think about reading, we shouldn't be thinking about reading without writing. Now, it is possible to read without learning to write. So that I want to be clear about that. When we think about writing, though, it's not possible to learn to write without reading. I mean, these 2 things are very interconnected. And I would argue for school-age students that we should be talking about learning as well, that these operate together. Reading and writing are tools for learning in school environments. And so, we could expand the way we conceptualize this. In terms of thinking about if you have reading and writing together, I know that we're kind of driven by the National Reading Panel's, 5 pillars, but there's a slightly different way of looking at it, and that's to look at the literature that takes a look at how you move from being a novice in an area to becoming competent, and eventually in some areas becoming an expertise. And they often talk about 3 different kinds of catalyst. And one is your knowledge. And so like in any area, whether it's reading, writing, or the study of dinosaurs, if you'd like, you start with very little knowledge, and over time that knowledge in that area becomes richer and more interconnected. And that tends to be a catalyst that drives development in that area. Your strategic prowess, initially in reading or in writing, if we're trying to comprehend something and we're 6 years old, or we're trying to write something, our strategic approach is pretty, it's pretty basic. But as we become more mature, it becomes much more sophisticated. And that would include things like, creating text with quality or reading comprehension. Also motivation, which is often left out of this. We have a variety of different motivational variables that can drive whether you engage in a task like writing or reading, how much effort you put into it, whether or not you persist in it. And then I would have an area that I would call skills. And those skills need to be mastered if either reading, writing, or learning are going to operate successfully and succinctly and effectively. So it's a slightly different way of kind of posing that, pillars, but I'm sure there are other ways that other people could put forward too of doing that. I think the main thing is we don't want to forget that these things are interconnected. Sometimes it is important to talk about writing separately, so we make it clear that this is an important skill. But on the other hand, we've not done a great job of bringing these together and making the case that writing needs to be part of what we do in literacy just generally.
Yeah, I really agree with everything you all just said. And I just want to add one thought, and it's just Something I've noticed within the science of reading movement is that sometimes we get focused on specific solutions to specific problems, but that does leave people with the idea that instruction sort of always looks the same. And I think what instruction is going to look like in different grades is going to be really different. I have taught K to 12, and in secondary school, I do use a lot of strategy instruction. But I was quite resistant to strategy instruction when I was teaching primary. And that's not to weigh in on strategy instruction in this conversation. It's just to point out that how we teach is going to definitely be dependent on the cohort in front of us. Okay. My next question is for Amy, and that is, what type of instruction has the strongest research evidence when it comes to writing?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a lot of the meta-analyses from Steve and some of his doc students, including me, show that direct, explicit instruction in transcription is important early on, but also that we need to make sure that even our older writers have strong writing, typing, spelling skills in order to be fluent. And to kind of, if we're taking this analogy of reading, right, the goal of reading is comprehension. Well, if the goal of writing is meaning making and expression, you've got to really free up space from being bogged down in transcription. So we want transcription to be taught explicitly, lots of practice with handwriting, spelling, typing. I talk to my university students a lot about that. I think we think that young learners come to school and they understand how to use technology, but the reality is that a lot of them are still quite disfluent with typing. So really supporting transcription skills so that then the focus can be on what we know about genre instruction, what we know about strategy instruction, what we know about teaching students about text structure, using writing models, has research behind it, teaching students, as the other members have said today, to use writing across the curriculum because it does support learning. It does support reading. So I think we have a broad understanding of what works across both kind of these lower level writing skills as well as higher level writing processes.
Does anybody want to add on to that? I'll just say that I think it's funny that you're hitting on that word, explicit and direct instruction. I think that's just I'm doing several of these round tables on the science of, and I think that's going to be a theme in all of it, that students require some level of explicit instruction in all strands. Steve, you look like you want to respond to that statement.
Yeah, so I'm an explicit instruction supporter, but I would also point out that there are things that are learned implicitly, and that the more skilled you are as a writer, the more implicit stuff may come into play. And let me just give like two real simple examples. If you take a look at spelling as an example, typically if we taught spelling to kids in first grade to sixth grade, the most words that you're going to do in that period of time is about 3,600. Most people that are adults can spell 10 to 15,000 words. So you learn how to spell an awful lot elsewhere. And a lot of that probably comes from reading, because you see the patterns, and some comes from writing because you do it. So in spelling, I think that explicit instruction gives you the foundation to look for patterns and recognize patterns in words, but also the fact that you read and write make a difference. If you ask me, the second point I'd like to make, if you ask me, well, what if we just had a program where kids wrote or kids read? I'd say to you, that's probably not going to be enough for 99% of the kids. I don't know what the percentage is. I just made that up. But we've got two new meta-analysis coming out now. And basically, we didn't find that increasing how much students wrote made any difference at the elementary level or at the secondary level. But if you said to me, would you have a program where kids don't write? There's no chance that I would say to you, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's the game. That's what we're helping students get prepared for, is to participate in the game, and they can participate along the way. And a lot of the procedures that we've mentioned already, like strategy instruction, kids are writing as they learn. So I think that's the important part here, is that if you're learning something explicitly, you have to have a place to apply it, and some incidental learning occurs there. And so I know that we're all on this kind of explicit bandwagon now, but I think it's important we don't forget that the implicit can be very important as well.
It's really fascinating. And it almost seems like a slight cognitive dissonance in the science, and that writing more didn't improve writing outcomes. You would never think that. And it almost seems like you almost can't extrapolate that as like a recommendation to teachers, like, well, it doesn't matter how much you write, so don't worry about it. But I just one follow-up question for Steve and for anyone in the podcast, and this wasn't on our plan list of questions, but your comment about spelling just made me think. I constantly get this question sent to me in DMs: should I still do my weekly spelling test? And I actually don't have a good answer, because I've never seen any convincing research specifically on that question. Now, I know you looked at some spelling in your meta-analysis, Steve, so you might be able to address that, but I know everyone here has some level of knowledge on that topic too, so I'd love to hear your inputs.
So I'll do this in two ways. When my daughter was in 5th grade, she went to a Quaker school in Washington, D.C. that emphasized a whole language approach. So there was very little instruction. And by 5th grade, a lot of the kids in the class had a lot of difficulty with spelling. And this isn't a rap against the teacher, because she was one of the best teachers I've ever seen. But her teacher decided that every week kids would have a spelling list, and they generated their own words. And as you might expect, they generated words that they would never use in their writing, because a peer had to test them. So they didn't want to look like they didn't know how to spell. So spelling lists can be used in ways that are not very helpful. And I don't think that was really helpful. But I do think if you have a spelling list that emphasizes, say, like 2 or 3 patterns that you're building off of through word sorts and learning like that, then you can learn about the underlying orthography, how, letters and sounds are connected in English, which can be quite difficult. And that serves as a springboard for recognizing those kind of patterns in words. So I think in those instances, it does make a difference. And, we've never published this. We've got a meta-analysis of about 200 studies, and it would support that as well. That, if you break your word list up into patterns that are emphasized, and that's what your focus of your spelling instruction is, not just on the memorization of words, it can make a difference.
God, why have you not published that?
Because we never seem to finish the thing. We've been working on it 10 or 12 years, and it's my fault, because the person I'm working with, Tangelo, gets everything coded, and then it takes me forever to get to something. And so we're like 3 years off of when we did the last search. So we'll get there eventually, I hope.
Well, you actually just cheered me up a little, because I have 4 meta-analyses I'm trying to get published right now. I've been working on them for about 8 months. So your 12 years makes me feel better about my 8 months.
Well, I'm not feeling too good about
it. Makes me feel good. All right. Amy, Lynn, Joe, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. I want to come back to the explicit instruction and kind of build on something two things that Steve meant or commented on. So on the explicit instruction, a big part of that, we're all familiar, right, with the gradual release of responsibility. And the time to then give the kids the chance to do the writing and to practice and get guided practice is that sort of we do it stage. But what I see happening too often is teachers grab the first part, the I do it, the explicit, they model, they explain, but then they don't provide enough time for practice. So that's one thing. I also want to, though, pick up on the word, this sort of explicit versus implicit. And I do believe that sharing with students models of good writing, not just generic, here's a great book, why don't you write a book like this, right? But really focusing in, if you're trying to teach kids how to use transition words or how to write a good topic sentence, show them some sample mentor models. But again, where I think we don't go far enough is we just show them to the kids, and then we figure out we think they're gonna analyze it and figure out how to emulate it. And it's that explicit time to say, all right, let's look at these models. Let's analyze it. What did that writer do? Now let's see if you can try it in your writing. So, but the fact of the matter is we all learn by emulating other people, and that's why the more we read, the better we get at our writing. So you need that combination of exposure to see how others write, but also explicit instruction that includes lots of practice to write.
I would add to that, I think this is one part of SRSD, the decades long research supported program that Steve and Karen have developed, but thinking aloud is a huge part of good writing instruction. And I often see teachers really struggle with that. In my university classes, I say, you need to stand in front of the mirror and practice this. And then we have students practicing it in class, and it seems really hard for them to think aloud, kind of those hidden things that are going on in the mind of a writer that students need to see actively modeled, scaffolded. So the things that writers do to get started, the things that writers do to draw on strategies they know, the things that writers do when they get stuck. And these are all things in SRSD, right? But they're very difficult. Teachers find that a little awkward, particularly I think novice teachers to do. And it's really important because, like you were saying, Joan, if you kind of skip that stage of scaffolding the writing process, you miss out on kind of the meat of where students can really learn to take it up on their own.
Yeah.
I completely agree 100% with everything everyone just said there. So I'm surprised Lyn doesn't have something to say about the spelling test, to be honest. But
I'll get my time, I'm sure.
you have a question specifically for spelling, so you are coming up. So okay. Despite the fact that Lyn is not yet spoken and she is coming up, the next question is for Joan. Although I thought about giving this question to Lyn too, to be honest. And that is, what is the current state of writing instruction in schools? Is there anything you think that we really need to improve?
We need to improve all of it. We need to have more of it. I was very engaged when reading first came out, was a lead trainer in our state. And while I think it's wonderful what came out of the National Reading Panel and all the efforts then and now, one of the things that I saw happening is when I left my work at Landmark School in '98, I've been going into schools and districts ever since. So I see a lot of this like in the trenches. And I think a lot of whatever writing was happening before 2000, a lot of it got thrown out because people were trying to find more time for a literacy block, but it was all about reading. Add to that there's nobody's been aware of the research. So I think there's probably less writing going on than before. And much of what is going on is an approach that looks at writing as it's a natural thing. And if we just let kids write about what they like, they'll magically figure out how to write. So I don't see enough writing going on either during the literacy block and not as well as in content classrooms. A lot of my work is in adolescent literacy, and teachers just avoid writing. Some of it is the teachers are afraid to write themselves. So how could you teach something you don't like? They don't know how. There is so little professional development. I'm seeing that start to change. And so there's not enough of it. What there is just very sketchy. People grab things that have been around forever. The 6 traits, this thing, and it's like, yeah. And the other thing I'd like to say is, I believe, which is true as it relates to teaching comprehension. I think when we teach phonics, yes, you do need programs because you need the materials, right? But if we're really going to teach comprehension and integrate it into subject area learning, then it's the teacher's knowledge about how to effectively teach strategies, let's say, or show kids how to inference using the text they're reading in science and social studies and history. And I really feel like after grade 3, a lot of the writing instruction needs to be integrated while we teach science and history and math and everything else. So, and I don't see any of that. So whatever little bit about writing is happening, it's just in the ELA class. And I see people scrambling to find what's the best program that we should bring into the ELA block. And I don't think a program is a solution. I truly believe teachers need to have the background knowledge on how to integrate writing about what you're reading, writing, gosh, even sentence work. You don't need a program with lessons that dictate what you should say to kids. Just learn how to use sentence combining. It's such a simple thing and you can use it anywhere. So I'm kind of a little all over the place with this, but that's my initial reaction to your question. And I'd love to hear what others have to say, what they're seeing in the schools as well.
I have something on that. What I mean, I agree, of course, everything. I'm learning a lot, by the way, just listening to you all. But one thing that I did want to touch on, and what Joan was saying about the classroom, when I go into schools and coach schools and watch writing lessons, I do notice certain phenomena that are sort of across the board wherever I go, and I do travel the world and do this. One of them is that teachers don't model writing quite as often as they should. So there are lots of programs out there that will give you these resources, and it's PowerPoints, and they're flashing up onto the screen, and then students are supposed to write in response to that. In my view, teachers actually writing, physically writing on a board in front of students is to writing development what teachers reading to students is to reading development. You have a captive audience and you've got these children looking at this example of a fully developed lexicon and fully developed handwriting. You need to be looking at that all the time and watching a teacher write on the board. That's a tiny tweak that I think over time makes a big difference. And I say I think over time because I haven't seen any studies on that, but it's also my job to talk about tiny tweaks that are likely to get a better result and show up in your data. So yeah, more teacher writing, really, really important. The second thing about spelling lists, and I think we've all been talking about that too, is one of the maxims I have is that the best spelling list is a book. So whatever book you're studying to do with the knowledge-rich curriculum that I hope you're applying is the best spelling list. And that touches on Steve's catalysts. The first catalyst is knowledge. So yeah, that's what I've got just now.
I do just want to jump and say that I hear a lot of connection with what you're saying right now and what I heard in the roundtable I had on comprehension, just in that I keep hearing people say the writing needs to fit the texts that are being looked at in class, that it shouldn't be an isolated thing. For example, maybe I shouldn't be writing poems in my writing class and reading books about Norse mythology in my reading class.
Well, you could write poems about Norse mythology. I mean, there are lots of ways to integrate knowledge. But I also talk about these things called orphan words, orphan sentences, orphan paragraphs, and they're orphans because they don't really have any family connections. And as we know, words exist in networks, and if you're writing about what you're learning, you're going to get a better deal on both sides, in that you'll develop your writing and you'll develop your knowledge, your content knowledge. So orphan words, I used to do this in my own practice when I talked to children and we're trying to teach them to spell a word or write a sentence or do a paragraph. I would just do stuff about my dog because I like my dog, right? And he's great and I like talking about him. But at some point I realized that this isn't building anything here. These are just orphans. So even that tweak of, if in your scope and sequence you're doing CK and you're learning about birds, maybe choose chick, over thick, right? And that even that, just that little bit of consideration, I think it would be helpful for teachers.
Okay, so my next question is for Steve, and this is his last question that's specific to him, although he's welcome to jump in on other people's points. And that's, does handwriting improve reading outcomes? And I must admit, I'm a little selfish in including this question because I get this question all the time in my DMs, and I think it's sort of an interesting question that we see coming up so often. So without any further ado, what are your thoughts, Steve? Does handwriting improve reading outcomes?
Well, I'm going to answer that in I always go with the maxim, answer the question you want to answer, not the one that's posed. So I'm going to go a little bit broader. We did a survey, random sample of teachers a number of years ago in the US, taking a look at handwriting instruction. And there's a lot of kind of myth that circulates around handwriting and its effects. I mean, all the way from, if you teach handwriting, it makes you a smarter person to a more organized. I mean, it's really kind of interesting, the things that have kind of popped up around that. And we asked teachers what they thought. And invariably, teachers talked about the effects of handwriting on writing, not on other things, and that included reading. Now, when we did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago, and we really didn't find much evidence that would say that, teaching handwriting made you a better reader in any way. There was a couple of studies back in the 1930s or 40s where teaching handwriting in manuscript versus in cursive had a little bit of a positive transfer to reading, print text, but it really wasn't that strong. Now, can handwriting help improve reading? Yeah. Just because there's not research saying this doesn't mean that it can't be done in a way in which the two can be reciprocal. So, if I'm introducing a letter, I can also be introducing the letter sound at the same time, and we could say the letter, say the sound, and write the letter. So I would see that as having a positive and interactive effect with reading. If you said, where are the studies that isolate that effect? I can't give them to you. But if I was teaching, which I haven't been a teacher for 40-something years, you can bet that if I was teaching handwriting, I'd be doing exactly what I just said. And
would
I
that
would
have any
also,
benefit though, say over typing the letter and then saying what sound is that, or
well,
say printing the
okay,
letter?
I didn't understand the question. So,
Oh, my apologies.
yeah, no, it's not your fault, because I said I was going to answer the question I wanted to. That data is all over the place. So I'm going to use another analogy here. So I went into the office today to copy 100 pages of a material that I've been asked to look at by the College Board for high school students. And I could have done that online, right? Most of my students today would have, annotated online and done it like that. Not me. I have to have, a type copy that I can write on and make notes on. I think this is a shifting target. I think, it can be helpful, like in note taking and other kinds of things, but I suspect that whatever evidence is collected on this will shift over time as one becomes more familiar with the newer tools for, either reading or writing. And that's a area that's in complete flux on us right now. So if you said, what does the research say? I would say it's a bit all over the place. I think for, kind of remembering information from text, it might be helpful. But, in terms of remembering individual words, it's from Stanovich to Berninger to other people. It's been all over the place. I don't think you can draw a conclusion that you feel comfortable with.
I would say this, when I'm asked that question by kindergarten, first grade teachers who are beginning doing letter sound correspondences, what I suggest is, look, you have to teach the kids the letter formation anyway, you need to teach them the uppercase, the lowercase. What happens too often is they do the letter sound during one part of the day, and then later they grab some handwriting program and then they start practicing forming the letters. And while I hear you, Steve, that there might not be solid research that says, no, do them at the same time, right? Why not? Because, there are several programs out there that are phonics programs that are really effective. And if you're forming those letters, you're going to attend to what they look like, at which you're trying to associate the sound to what that letter looks like. So
we don't disagree on that. Like I said, if I was teaching now, that's exactly what I would do. It makes the most logical sense.
Yeah. The question that I get a lot, and you, Nate, and I'm sure all of us do, is should we be teaching cursive or switching and spending that time to teaching typing? And the jury's out on that one.
Yeah, and that was the question I was trying to pose actually, is should we be teaching students to cursive write or print or type or some combination of the three? And realistically, I think Steve's work shows that cursive writing does show benefits for writing. But I mean, the question I always get is, does that cursive writing instruction, is it particularly better for reading outcomes than typing or printing? Because that claim does seem to exist. And I'm going to throw a statement out, and anyone's welcome to respond. I feel like there's this almost mythos around cursive writing, as if it has some neurological magical benefit on students if we just cursively write as opposed to print or type.
So
I mean, I think ultimately, if
Yeah,
we
go
all
ahead.
look at ourselves as adult writers, we probably use some hybrid of print and cursive, right? When we're printing. And so from my perspective and thinking about a teacher's perspective and also as a professor now, I think that the ultimate goal would be that we teach things and then our students can modify them in ways that work for them, right? And so you probably get a little faster with writing if you're using some hybrid of print and cursive. But what I hear everybody saying, and what I would argue for, is this integration, right? If we're integrating reading and writing, handwriting and phonics, we're not only emphasizing the connections between the skills, but we're also kind of giving teachers more instructional time because they don't have to teach everything separately. They don't have to teach writing and then phonics and then comprehension and then maths, and then they can teach this combination. And so I say, like, it's more instructional bang for your buck because you can integrate these things in ways that make sense and that align with what we know from research and support your students using writing across the day rather than in, you know, the 30-minute block with a particular program. So that's kind of my take on it.
Okay. Well, the next question is for Lyn, and I think this is a passion area for her, and that's how best do we teach spelling to students?
Well, that's a tiny little question. So I'll answer that in one sentence. No. It depends on what you mean by spelling as well, and whether we're talking about novices or people who have already started to build their lexicon. There's a use of the word spelling which I don't subscribe to, and some people will call it encoding, and I can understand why you would do that, and that's transcription of sounds to symbols. So in an opaque orthography like the one that we have, it's a really, really good starting point to make sure that their phonological awareness is sufficiently present so that they can segment words. That's great. It's good to have a working phonics inventory so that you can, you know, you can start to write down the component sounds of words. But none of those things are particularly what I would call spelling. So spelling is actually using knowledge about the system, the orthographic system, to write familiar and unfamiliar, regular and irregular words with the correct letter sequences. And a lot of the time, that's not really got a lot to do with sound. Once you've mastered that basic phonics code, you have to look at the other layers of the orthography, and that will be orthographic expectancies like rules, it will be etymology, which drives letter sequences as well, and it will be morphology, which is quite stable and transferable to lots and lots of other words that you haven't seen before. So in comes that big dirty secret in education. We build our lexicon implicitly, you know, that's what we do. So how best to teach spelling? Make sure that children from the start understand that there are other layers, not just sound to symbol, and get them to practice that. The practice that I always strongly recommend is integrating. I think every single person here has said integration a few times, and integrating those things throughout the day. The way I talk to teachers about that is I say, there's a loop. If you consider it a loop, a receptive expressive loop. So if you're showing children a letter and you're saying to them, this is a or a, yep, that's receptive and it's great, but you can consolidate and help them to really form those structures that they're going to need for implicit learning and for instant recognition and instant retrieval, hopefully, if you get them to write that straight away, right? And what that takes is meta language for novices. It takes meta language. It takes, this is the line that you write on, this is the highest point, this is the middle, and these are how you form the letters. And that meta language needs to be embedded within the students. That's how I would teach spelling. Right? So you can look at all of those pillars and apply them to writing, and spelling is in every single part of that. Phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and having people understand what you're writing, their comprehension.
I have a selfish follow-up question, but I'm gonna let's see if anybody else has a response to you first. Oh, okay. Well, I do want to say first, and it's kind of shining through that I've been working on my book on this topic right around the time of doing this interview. with everyone. But I just was writing about spelling in my book, and I refer to it as encoding. So maybe I'll have to go back and think about whether or not to use the term encoding for spelling in my book.
There's
But
no need not to use it, but if you are talking about the process of listening to the sounds in words and attaching graphemes to those sounds, then that is encoding. That's transcription of speech sounds. But we don't have a transparent orthography. So spelling is more than transcription of speech sounds. So spelling and encoding, I think, are different things. So yeah, Nate, if you mean spelling in the way that you and I have talked about spelling, it's
yeah.
probably best to say spelling.
Well, admittedly, I was talking about it in the idea that when we teach phonics, rather than, I often see phonics lessons that are like, here's the letter, here's the most commonly associated sound. Now let's practice blending these words, or let's look at these words that use the sound. And I was talking about, well, let's give them some encoding practice at the same time and have them spell with it rather than just read with it. That was the context I was using in. But I do want to go back to the fact that English does not have a transparent orthography, because you and I are both very familiar with Pete Bauer's work, and he talks a lot about the importance of morphology of spelling. And there was a meta-analysis on this topic by Glushka in 2020 that showed that morphology had the highest outcomes for spelling. And I will admit, as a teacher this year, I really, really tried as hard as I could to use as much morphology instruction specifically for the purpose of spelling in my class. But I also want to admit, and maybe this is because I've not taken your master class yet on morphology, although I intend to, it is difficult to teach a large number of words morphologically in the classroom, because there's just so many morphemes out there and so much to learn as a teacher. And I have to admit, I'm finding it more useful to teach it from a bit of both, to use both a phonics and a morphology approach to teaching spelling rather than relying on just one. And I was curious about your thoughts.
Sure. I just want to, I've got lots of thoughts on that. Just want to talk about encoding and decoding and draw a line under that.
Sure.
If you have these two words, encoding and decoding, and you're not talking about the other parts of spelling, like orthography, morphology, etymology, then what you're stating is that encoding and decoding are reversible processes, and they aren't in a transparent orthography. They are, in an opaque orthography. They're not reversible. Just because you can read a word doesn't necessarily mean that you can write it, not in this orthography. So when you're using encoding, again, I would urge caution to not get that mixed up with spelling. To address the morphological statements that you made, yeah, I don't think it's a particularly good idea, and I haven't seen any research to support the idea that start with morphology. That, I think, would undo the good work and the highly successful approaches that have been developed over the last few decades regarding phonics. You really do have to teach default phoneme grapheme correspondences. It's a very quick way to getting children into that self-teaching zone where they again are implicitly learning. However, we've got a little bit of hypercorrection in that as well, where people are starting to embrace, really in mass, everywhere, people are starting to embrace phonics and then going, okay, so every letter sequence, that's got to be a spelling for a sound. And that's where we start to get into trouble. That's where morphology and etymology trumps that approach. That's where you bring it in. Whenever there's a letter sequence that can't be explained unless you shoehorn a phoneme into a grapheme, danger is there.
Lyn, I would add to that, I agree completely about, especially after third grade, fourth grade, where we're dealing with multi-syllable words. What I find from a practical point of view with teachers is most educators or teachers don't know enough about etymology, don't themselves know, they know the obvious roots, right? Spec and aqua, and it's like they know a handful, but in order to really do some of the stuff that Pete Bowers and company, suggest, you have to know a lot of the meanings of the roots and know large word families that connect. And it's the practical application that I see a lot of teachers beyond grade 3 or 4 they struggle with that because they themselves don't know that. And it's not like if you pick certain words as perfect examples of how that works in a workshop, that's great. But in the classroom, the words are going to come up in the text the kids are reading. And if the teacher doesn't know the historical background of the word or why it's pronounced differently now than it was in Old English, the whole system is practically difficult to apply, I would say.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The alternative, though, to studying words like that, and this is before third grade as well. I mean, look at wasn't said and all the question words and so on, right? The alternative is to just say this letter sequence is a spelling for the sound blah. And that's a problem too. So what I try to give to teachers is this idea that firstly, there are really good examples. And you can take the Dolch list and you could do that sort of list much better in grades 1, 2, and 3, just by grouping words in families. You don't have to even know the story. You can see where there's overlap between those families and teach them together. And the other thing is practice as well. You don't have to know the story to practice the word. So if you've got something like, was, well, default grapheme to phoneme, that's w, a, s. So I can say it two ways. In my spelling voice, w, a, s. And in my reading voice, I say was. That's really efficient. And I didn't have to know what the great vowel shift was or, anything like that. That's to me logical and doesn't require too much of it, Pete Bauer's depth of knowledge. Yes, and that's what I recommend. Otherwise, the alternative is every letter sequence is a spelling for a sound, and that creates phonetic spellers and people who never are able to come out of that.
Yeah, I just want to add one final comment to that before I get to the last question to Amy, unless someone else wants to jump in. And I just want to make sure that no one thinks I'm criticizing Dr. Pete Bowers here. I think Dr. Pete Bowers is a genius, far brighter than myself. And while I have disagreements with him on pedagogy, I would not pretend to be as smart as Dr. Pete Bowers, not even close. Dr. Amy, would you be willing to share your perspective on how writing instruction should change, as students get older?
Oh, well, I'm hoping everybody else here who has much more experience than me will also answer this. I think that obviously we're expecting students typically to produce longer texts, to develop voice and style as they grow older and become more proficient writers. But I would argue that a lot of the things that people might say need to wait until students are older can be introduced when they're younger. So here in Australia, and I'm relatively new, less than a year here, there's a lot of focus on genre, even with really young learners in the primary grades. And I think sometimes we think that young learners can't learn to write, a nonfiction text, or can't be exposed to other genres besides narrative at a young age. We have to wait until third grade until they can write a persuasive text. And I don't think that's the case. So I think even with young learners, we can think about genres. We can think about developing, a style, a voice of writing, teaching how to vary sentence structure. I know Joan mentioned sentence combining. We can do those things with young writers, but I think over time, obviously, we're expecting that our students are going to be developing. I feel really strongly, as I said, about once our students are fluent, they can focus more on the content that they're producing. They can produce longer texts. They can develop style. They can think about their audience and the messages that they're conveying. But I think authentic writing tasks, multiple genres, those things can be introduced to really young learners as well.
Does anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I want to piggyback on something that Amy said and also add a little bit of other thoughts to that. For a long time, when we were doing strategy instruction in the US with elementary grade students, you couldn't get in the door if you weren't doing stories or personal narratives. And that made no sense to me. Anybody who's ever had a kid who's 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, they're natural arguers. They know how to put an argument forward. They also know how to explain quite well. And so, we started like slowly. We did 4th grade with an opinion task. We moved to 3rd grade. We moved to 2nd grade. And we realized that in some ways, to me, a natural starting point was actually opinions versus stories. And kids knew quite a bit about both. So I think this idea that there's certain kinds of writing that are for a certain age, those are kind of modes of thinking that we get stuck in. I'm not sure, I'm going to say something controversial now. I'm not sure that I see writing as a naturally developing skill. I don't think we know what students can do at different ages at this point, or within an age range, kind of the variability that exists. We still have a lot to learn about that. In terms of moving forward, as your question was, to me, there's 2 things that are very important. One is flexibility. So, if you take like the, writer's workshop process approach, I want kids to be engaged in thinking and planning and evaluating and monitoring and reworking, etc. But I don't always want them to do that in a step-by-step fashion. When you look at professional writers, they'll talk about doing different things on different types of writing tasks. We want kids to be more and more flexible in terms of the use of their knowledge as they approach new tasks and old tasks as they mature. I'd also say another thing that I think is very important is we want them to become more metacognitive. And by that, I mean, we want them to be more thinking and thoughtful about what they're doing. And something as simple as grammar. Why am I using how do I use these particular grammar structures to enhance something that I want to say? So Deborah Myhill's work in England would be a great example of this. And it can go all the way from kind of these, skills of language to skills of thinking in terms of writing. And so I see those as very critical, being more flexible and being more metacognitive as we mature as writers.
Nate, I'm wondering if part of what you were trying to get at in this question was what should be taught at each grade level. And I say this because I'm often getting emails from people. What's the scope and sequence for teaching writing? Do we teach sentences in kindergarten first and paragraphs in second and multi-paragraphs in third? I'd love to hear others on this. It's not a scope and sequence that you're done teaching something once and then you leave it. I mean, the whole idea of there's multi-components, just like in reading, you keep working on comprehension, you keep growing fluency, you keep growing vocabulary. And so I feel like a lot of the skills and strategies that I've tried to organize into the writing rope, they should be part of a writing curriculum in every grade. The difference is that based on that developmental level of the students and the complexity of what they're reading and are writing about is going to ramp it up. So yes, you're going to work on sentence basic, just the notion that there's 2 parts to a sentence with kindergartners and first graders, but you might all the way up into high school be working on sentence elaboration with kids who are really good writers, but need to ramp their sentence writing up. So I don't know if you all get that question. What's the scope? When do we teach paragraphs? When do we teach? And I think I'm still learning how to write better paragraphs, and I'm an old adult now. So I'd love to hear what others think about that.
I have some thoughts about that. It's the holy grail, isn't it? The scope and sequence, out comes an idea and everyone's like, do you have a scope and sequence for that? And I think one of the answers is to make the distinction between constrained and unconstrained skills. So lots of people are very, very familiar with the reading rope and the fact that the top part of the reading rope is unconstrained. You continue to grow and develop your strategy till the day you die. I mean, I'm a different writer and reader from the one that I was 10 years ago. That will always, always be developing and changing. And then there's the constrained skills, the lower part of the reading and writing rope, which is transcription and decoding. At some point, you are automatic at that in an ideal world. That's where you need to get to. Now, that automaticity, of course, and engendering that automaticity is the business of the first 3 years of school. That's what we want. That's where the instructional time and energy and practice needs to go. But that doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to the top part and increase that strategy as well. So making that distinction between constrained and unconstrained is really helpful. For me and for the teachers that I work with, when they say, what's the scope and sequence? It's, well, get those constrained skills done as quickly as possible. And then the rest of the time you're free in terms of cognitive load to look at the top parts of those models.
Well, that brings me to my final question, which is just for everyone, and that's just, do you have any final thoughts or advice or tips you would like to give teachers? And that's open to anybody. Amy would like to start.
Well, I just thought of something as we were all chatting, and it's been mentioned, but I think one thing we want to say, and if we're talking to teachers, is that I think there's a considerable amount of time spent facilitating students' love for reading, right? Find topics they enjoy, expose them to a variety of literature. If you have a student who loves football, bring 10 different books about football into your classroom. And I think one thing that will be important across the grades is to develop students who love writing and see themselves as writers. So this idea of letting students write for fun, write for pleasure, use invented spelling if they don't know how to spell something yet, see writing as something enjoyable so they don't get to, upper primary, secondary grades and really have a dislike of it. I think developing students who enjoy writing and see it as something fun, exciting, engaging to do is really important across grade levels.
Do you mind if I add 2 things quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of those is I think for those of us who are engaged in thinking about writing, from whether we're talking about teachers or we're talking about academics or we're talking about people who do professional development or work with teachers, is to keep an open mind. And I give an example of this. We just published a study in Norway that was 2 years in duration. And we were actually hoping that we'd get effects. It was an incidental approach to teaching writing. And so we developed lessons, not lessons completely, because Norway, you just don't hand a lesson to a teacher. You basically have something that they work around and they look to implement. It's a little different than doing a study in the US in some ways. But very interesting and I think engaging kinds of activities that kids could be involved in writing over a 2-year period. We got no effect whatsoever, nothing, basically compared to business as usual. So it was based on a naturalistic learning approach. I wouldn't do anything if I didn't think we'd get some effects. So I was stunned when we got nothing out of this. And my colleague from Norway was here 2 weeks ago. And I asked him how the study was being, taken in Norway. And he said, well, all I've been told was it was a lousy study. And I said, it's randomized control trials, 2,000 kids. We had good fidelity. I said, well, why? Why did people say that? And he said, nobody's telling me that there's a problem in the study. It's a matter of your mindset. Basically, his colleagues all believe that a naturalistic approach will work. So it doesn't matter what the data says, it works. And I think that's a trap we have to watch ourselves. I think it can go both ways on this. I want to be quite frank about that. The second thing is I had a conversation today with my university in terms of the Writing Center, which we have 100 and something thousand students. So we're a large place. And they're getting ready to revamp. And they're working with a group called Grammarly. And there's going to be a lot of stuff around AI. And as we talked about this, I thought, you know, we're in a really changing world here in terms of what this technology is going to mean for writing and how writers perceive. And so whatever I say today, 5 years from now, we're looking at a completely different landscape. And it's a landscape that, you know, if you're a teacher like yourself, or if you're an academic like me, or somebody working with teachers, it's, I think it's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary in some ways as well. And I'm gonna be interested to see where we end up on this. You know, I think the future of writing is machine and man, or man and machine, or person and machine, woman and machine, however you wanna say that. I'm just hoping it's not machine by itself.
I actually tend to agree with you that I think we're going to see more integration. And I will admit, I have played with ChatGPT a lot, and it's an incredibly fun toy. But what it does so far is, for the most part, pretty terrible. But I imagine that as it gets better, people will want to integrate it more into their writing. But I still kind of have the inkling that people are going to always have to edit whatever ChatGPT or whatever AI gives them, because it's just oftentimes it's not convincing. It's full of errors because it's a plagiarism machine.
Yeah, that's not the part I'm worried about. I'm worried about if it's machine does the work. What's important about writing is the thinking that goes on when you write. And so if it takes that out of our hands, then the learning that can occur as a result of writing is minimized or disappears. You know, I do believe that these machines will get better. I've been talking with teachers and others that have been using this, and they've been using it in very innovative ways, both for designing lessons and for what their students do. And it will get better. But I'm afraid, you know, like I said, if it takes away the thinking part of writing, we've lost something.
Well, I think then that also echoes Amy's point about making sure that writing is an enjoyable task, so that we don't defer to machines, you know. So it takes the schlep out of the boring parts of writing, you know, like doing marketing emails, which is just, for me, a horrible thing that ChatGPT is taken care of now. But in terms of my enjoyment of writing, if we instill or find better ways to instill that early, hopefully our robot overlords won't take that task away from us.
I'm gonna admit one shameful thing. I tried to use ChatGPT to write a marketing email for me, and it was so braggadocious that I could not possibly bring myself to click send on that, and I had to just delete the entire thing and write something from scratch.
But Nate, didn't you just say, okay, stop making it so braggadocious? I mean, they do listen, right?
I didn't even think of that. I just read this incredibly braggadocious, like, this is the best thing you've ever read. And I'm like, well, that's not true. You can't say that.
All you have to do is write the prompt, turn the volume down on the braggadociousness, right? I'm sure it'll understand.
Okay.
So Nate, I think you asked us, were there any like final sort of comments? And what I'm going to do is just run through what I say at the end of every keynote address at a conference, right? Number one, integrate reading and writing. Number two, don't make any assumptions about the skills that our students have. In fact, the older they get, the more we do that. And we can't assume that a 15-year-old can write a good sentence. Number three, writing is multi-componential, and don't focus on just one or two things because that's what you know or love, but we've got to integrate all of these skills and strategies and techniques into a writing curriculum. And then finally, every teacher can and should play a role in teaching writing. It is not just the responsibility of the English teacher. So those are the four things that whenever I'm asked that kind of question, that's what I say. I got them memorized.
Well, I think that's great. My big takeaway from everyone was definitely that writing and reading instruction should be integrated together. I'd like to say that a big takeaway from this for me is there's definitely a science of writing, and that we need to be making sure that when we're planning our literacy block, that we're devoting an equal amount of time, or at least a comparable amount of time, for both writing and reading. If anyone wants to disagree with me, feel free to speak.
I don't think
Awesome.
you're going to get in a disagreement from this group on that.
Nailed it. I'm so happy about that. I was secretly slightly worried that someone would be like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Okay. Well, on that awesome note, I'd like to end this podcast and thank our wonderful panelists for joining us today. I had a absolute blast talking to you all, and it was a pleasure to learn from each and every one of you.
Thank you.
for inviting us.
Thanks, Nate.